Just a temp nurse. That's what they saw when Rachel Torres smoothed her scrubs and stepped into the fluorescent glare of Cedar Creek Medical's night shift. Her badge still smelled of fresh laminate, the ID photo showing a woman with hollow eyes and dark circles that weren't entirely theatrical. 3 months of work history. No advanced degrees. No prestigious credentials. She moved through the trauma department like a shadow, quiet, efficient, invisible, and that's exactly what she needed to be. The fentanyl diversion was happening somewhere inside these walls, a careful bleeding of controlled substances into black market networks, and Rachel had been placed here to find out who was turning the hospital into a pharmacy for addicts and dealers. Her nursing license was real. Her credentials were airtight. Everything else was a cover so deep she sometimes forgot which version of herself was actually breathing. The parking lot behind Cedar Creek was still damp from morning rain, the smell of wet asphalt mixing with diesel exhaust from the loading dock. She'd arrived at 10:41 p.m., 6 minutes early, the way soldiers arrive everywhere. Early means you control the space. Her fingers traced the crash cart inventory as she walked past the supply rooms, counting access points, noting timestamps on the security camera feeds. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed like wounded insects, and she let the sound anchor her into the hospital's rhythm. After 14 years of operating in places where the walls were concrete and the air tasted like copper and dust, the sterile hum of Cedar Creek felt almost peaceful. Almost. The trauma bay doors slid open with a whisper, and she moved inside, her eyes already cataloging exits. First left corner, door to the stairwell. Back wall, secondary exit blocked by an anesthesia cart, could move it in 4 seconds. Front entrance, open but monitored. Her hands had learned this habit in places she didn't discuss anymore, in provinces spelled wrong by the people who sent her there. Helmand. Paktika. Loga. Places where you didn't walk into a room without knowing how to leave it. Ms. Torres. The voice came from behind her, clipped and dismissive. Dr. Marcus Mercer stood in the hallway, his white coat pristine, his tie pinned with a gold medical school pin that probably meant more to him than it should. He was the kind of doctor who'd spent 32 years building credentials the way other men build monuments, carefully, obsessively, each letter perfect. The temp nurse in front of him represented everything he'd been trained to despise: underqualified, underpaid, temporary. She would be gone in 3 months. He would still be here. You'll be working tonight under Dr. Cheng's supervision. Try not to break anything. Yes, doctor. The words came out soft, almost deferential. Rachel had practiced this voice in the mirror of her studio apartment on Victory Drive, the one she rented under her nursing name, not her real name. Not Captain Rachel Torres, Silver Star recipient, commander of Operation Rescue Dawn, Al-Malik al-Aswad to the people who'd seen her move through Helmand province like something not quite human. The temp nurse version of Rachel Torres said things like "yes, doctor," and kept her eyes down. Mercer watched her with something approaching satisfaction, the way a man watches a problem he's already solved. She was everything he needed her to be, untrained enough to dismiss, experienced enough to delegate work to, temporary enough to remove if she became inconvenient. His brother-in-law was a state representative. His wife's family controlled 3 law firms. One phone call and Rachel Torres could disappear from the healthcare system entirely, her name flagged in every hospital network from Atlanta to Jacksonville. He didn't know yet that he would need to make that call. He was only beginning to understand that destroying her would become his mission. The night shift settled into its rhythm around them. Nurses moved between stations like synchronized swimmers, each one in a choreography they'd learned months ago. Rachel positioned herself at the supply counter, her hands moving through inventory with mechanical precision. Crash cart, check. Thoracotomy kit, the surgical instruments for opening a chest cavity in the field, the razor-edged scalpel and retractors that could mean the difference between alive and not alive, that got special attention. Defibrillator pads in the drawers. Airway management tubes. Epinephrine. The 1 mg auto-injector pens lined up in rows like soldiers. She knew this equipment better than she knew her own apartment. She'd used half of it in places where the nearest hospital was 4 hours away by helicopter, in operating tents where the surgery light came from battery-powered rigs and the anesthesia was whatever wouldn't kill the patient before the bleeding stopped. One of the resident nurses, a younger woman named Katie with blonde hair pulled into a practical bun, asked Rachel a question about charting protocols. Rachel answered in short, efficient sentences. Click the red flag. Note the timestamp. Save to the secure server. Katie nodded and moved on. Rachel had learned long ago that people like to be told exactly what to do, and they trusted people who told them clearly. Command presence, her old squad leader had called it. The ability to make people follow you because they knew you'd thought about the next 3 steps and the 3 after that. At 11:34 p.m., the radio on the wall crackled. The dispatcher's voice came through clear and professional. Cedar Creek, this is Savannah EMS. We have a priority transport, male patient, approximately 40 to 50 years old, unidentified, significant head trauma and lower extremity injury sustained in a 2-vehicle collision at mile marker 12 on I-95. ETA 6 minutes. Copy that, Savannah EMS. Trauma Bay 1, stand by. Dr. Cheng hung up the phone and turned to the assembled team. Unidentified patient, trauma protocol. Everybody set? Rachel was already moving toward the trauma bay, but she moved at the same pace as the other nurses, no faster, no slower. The last thing she needed was to appear competent. Competence from a temp nurse made people nervous, especially people like Dr. Mercer, who measured his entire worth by the degrees on his wall and the titles under his name. She pushed the mobile crash cart into position, arranged the equipment in the precise sequence that would allow a doctor to grab what he needed without looking. The thoracotomy kit went center, where trained hands could reach it in darkness if they needed to. Chest decompression needles at 2 o'clock. Airway management on the left. Medications in a careful arc. By muscle memory. By instinct. By the kind of preparation that only came from having made these decisions when the cost of being wrong was measured in bodies in a morgue. The ambulance doors burst open 6 minutes later, and the paramedics rolled the stretcher inside with controlled urgency. The patient was a man, thick-bodied, weathered, his left arm wrapped in field dressing, his face battered and swollen. A scar ran from his left eye to his jawline, the kind of scar that came from blast shrapnel. Rachel's hand stopped moving for exactly half a second, the only reaction she permitted herself. The paramedic was reading vitals, BP 88/52, heart rate 118, responsive to pain stimuli, GCS score of 7, and the team swung into motion like a choreographed machine, each person knowing their role, each movement precise. But Rachel wasn't looking at his face. She was looking at his jacket, the one the paramedics had cut away to access the trauma, the one that lay crumpled on the edge of the stretcher. Her eyes caught something they shouldn't have caught. Something stitched carefully into the inside lining. A patch. Faded. Military. She reached for it with the automatic motion of someone searching for identification, and her fingers found the embroidered insignia before her brain fully registered what she was seeing. It was a unit patch from Helmand Province. 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines. The unit David had served with. The unit David had loved, had written about in letters marked free delivery with childish drawings on the envelope, had talked about with the kind of pride that only 19-year-olds could muster. And sewn into the lining, hidden like a secret, like something precious, was a smaller patch beneath it. A call sign. 1 letter. 1 symbol. 1 moment of recognition that turned Rachel's entire body cold. The symbol was hers. The call sign belonged to her, the rank below, Dark Horse Actual. She was holding the jacket of someone who had served under her command. Someone from her unit. Someone who knew who she actually was. Ms. Torres, step back. Dr. Cheng's voice cut through her focus, and Rachel immediately moved away from the stretcher, her hands opening, releasing the jacket back onto the metal surface. She'd violated protocol by even touching the patient's belongings. She'd violated cover by recognizing something that a temp nurse from Savannah would never recognize. But when she looked up, Dr. Mercer was watching her from the corner of the bay, his eyes narrow, his expression carrying that particular quality of contempt that predators wore. He'd seen her react. He'd seen something shift in her face. She forced her voice back to soft, back to deferential. "Sorry, doctor. I was looking for identification." But she wasn't looking at Dr. Cheng anymore. She was looking at the unconscious man on the stretcher, at the scarred face and the broken body, and the recognition that whoever this Army Ranger was, he belonged to a life she'd buried 3 months ago. A life that was about to very carefully, very deliberately, be exhumed. The Ranger's sister left at dusk, after asking twice if her brother should be transferred to a better facility, and Rachel watched Dr. Mercer's smile widen with each question. By 7 o'clock the trauma bay had quieted to the soft percussion of monitors and ventilators, the kind of hospital silence that feels deliberate, purposeful. Rachel was changing the Ranger's dressings when Mercer entered, his footsteps announcing him before his voice did. He didn't lower his tone. He never did. "Miss Torres, perhaps you can explain why a temp nurse with barely 3 months' experience thinks she's qualified to manage a coma patient." His voice carried down the hallway like an announcement, loud enough that the nurses at the station looked up. The Ranger's sister had just reached the elevator. She turned around. Rachel kept her hand steady on the fall line, her fingers moving with the precision of someone who'd performed this task in a moving Black Hawk at 2,000 feet. Her voice emerged flat, professional, stripped of inflection. "His vitals are stable, doctor." Mercer stepped closer. His cologne, something expensive and cloying, overwhelmed the antiseptic smell of the trauma bay, that sharp chemical bite that usually meant safety, cleanliness, competence. "Stable because I'm monitoring your work, not because of any competence on your part." He gestured at the monitors with theatrical dismissal. "This patient deserves actual medical professionals, not whatever fast-track certification mill produced you." The sister's purse came off her shoulder. She was already asking if her brother needed transfer. Rachel's knuckles whitened on the bed rail, but her face remained expressionless, carved from something harder than flesh. She didn't look at Mercer. She didn't blink. She simply continued her work, each movement deliberate, controlled, the kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst. Her hands were steady as surgical lasers. "That won't be necessary," Mercer assured the sister, his smile predatory. "I'll personally ensure our temp worker here doesn't make any fatal mistakes." The sister left. Mercer remained in the doorway for another moment, savoring the space where his humiliation had landed, then turned back to the hallway. That afternoon, Rachel sat in the break room with her sandwich in a corner table, and the conversation stopped the moment she sat down. Nurse Jenkins glanced at Nurse Cardoso. Both stood, trays in hand, and moved to the far table without a word. 3 more nurses followed in succession, a choreography of rejection that had been carefully arranged in whispers and texts Rachel would never see. She was alone in a room built for 20, the vending machine humming its mechanical lament beside her. She took one bite. Chewed slowly. Swallowed. Didn't look up. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like trapped insects. Someone's phone chimed. Someone else laughed at a joke she couldn't hear, or perhaps a joke about her. It didn't matter. Rachel had sat in darker rooms than this. She'd sat with dying men in the dirt outside Sanjin Valley while rounds cracked overhead like thunder, and she'd held them steady. This was nothing. This was air conditioning and clean floors and people who got to go home at night. By evening, a formal write-up appeared on the unit board in the main hallway where all staff pass multiple times daily. Rachel stood before it at 5:16 p.m., reading the words that had been printed on hospital letterhead with the same precision Mercer applied to everything, meticulous, dated, time-stamped, his signature bold as a brand at the bottom, incident report, R. Torres, unauthorized examination of patient belongings, violation of privacy protocols, exceeding scope of practice. The sheet was laminated. He'd laminated it. Her reflection was visible in the glass frame protecting the board, a ghost of a woman looking back at herself. Dr. Patel walked past, read the report, shook his head. "Mercer's at it again," he muttered to a resident, but kept walking. Nobody stopped. Nobody questioned. The report was official, printed, signed, and therefore true. Mercer appeared beside her as if summoned by her attention to his work. He smelled of coffee and something darker, the scent of a man who had just won a small victory and was savoring it like wine. You people come in here with your shortcuts and your online degrees, thinking you can do in 3 months what took me 30 years to earn. His voice carried that particular brand of contempt reserved for those he considered beneath him, a voice like a tank idling in a garage, heavy and dangerous and utterly certain of its power. You don't belong in real medicine. Rachel turned to face him. Her eyes were dead calm, the kind of stillness you only achieve after you've stopped being afraid. She'd learned this look in places where fear was a luxury no one could afford. You've built your entire career on credentials you're terrified someone will actually test. The words emerged low and precise, each syllable a surgical cut. Mercer's face cycled through shock and rage in rapid succession. His mouth opened. Closed. Opened again. His hands trembled as they clenched at his sides, but Rachel was already turning away, her footsteps echoing in the silent hallway as she walked toward the stairwell. Behind her, Mercer stood flushed and stammering, the confidence that had sustained him suddenly fragile, suddenly visible for what it was, a performance, rehearsed and hollow and one sentence away from collapse. She didn't look back. 3 nights later, at 2:24 a.m., the monitors screamed in the darkness. Rachel was monitoring the ranger from the hallway. Mercer had restricted her to observation only, had clipped her access like he was pruning a garden, removing the problem before it could grow. She wasn't supposed to be near the patient. She was supposed to watch from the nurse's station like a ghost, like someone already fired, already gone. She was moving before the alarm completed its first cycle. The door to the trauma bay crashed open against the wall, and Rachel saw him immediately, lips blue, chest still, the ventilator hissing air into lungs that had stopped processing it into blood, into life, into anything that mattered. The night resident stood frozen, hands hovering over the crash cart like a prayer that hadn't learned how to become action. Chest decompressing, Rachel said. Not a request. A statement. The voice that emerged from her throat was different now, layered with authority that had nothing to do with a hospital ID badge. He's got tension pneumothorax. We have 90 seconds before cardiac arrest. The resident's eyes widened. We should wait for the attending. He'll be dead in 90 seconds. Rachel ripped open the thoracotomy kit, her hands moving on muscle memory older than her nursing license. She'd last done this in a field hospital outside Helmand Province, 8,000 miles away, with a combat knife instead of a scalpel and a man screaming instead of sedated. This was cleaner. Clinical. Precise. Scalpel. The resident handed it to her without further argument. Some part of him recognized authority when it walked into the room. Some part of him understood that this woman had done this before, that the quiet confidence in her voice came from a place most people never visited. Rachel's incision was decisive, swift, made between the second and third ribs with the certainty of someone who'd memorized anatomy not from textbooks but from necessity. Blood sprayed her scrubs, warm and immediate and terrifyingly real. She felt for the pericardium, the thin membrane protecting his heart, found the tension there, pressure that shouldn't exist, blood collecting where it had no right to be, suffocating the organ beneath. She released it. The hiss of air escaping. Her fingers found his heart. Began the massage, the rhythm, the pressure that converted her hands into something that could do what a failing organ could not. Push, release, the mechanical urgency of keeping something alive when it had decided to stop. The monitors beeped once. Twice. Established rhythm. The ranger gasped, an actual breath, unassisted, his body remembering how to want to survive. Dr. Mercer arrived as she was closing, his face cycling through shock and rage and something darker, something that looked like fear. "What have you done?" he whispered, the words emerging like they'd been forced through broken glass. Rachel stripped off her gloves. Blood clung to her scrubs, a map of the last 90 seconds written in her patient's chemistry. "A field thoracotomy," she said, her voice steady as stone. "He's alive." Mercer's eyes narrowed. He pulled out his phone, began documenting everything with the precision of a man building a case, photographing the bloody instruments, the open chest, Rachel's blood-soaked scrubs. The night resident tried to explain the emergency, tried to defend what had just happened, but Mercer silenced him with a gesture. "Leave. Now. You'll give your statement to administration, and you'll tell them exactly what you saw." By dawn, Rachel sat in the chief nursing officer's office, a stack of forms before her like an accusation. Each one was numbered, time-stamped, cross-referenced to the others. Practicing beyond scope of licensure, the CNO read, her voice apologetic but mechanical, the sound of someone following a script they didn't write but couldn't refuse. Performing surgical intervention without physician supervision. Contaminating a sterile field. Using medical equipment without authorization. Violating hospital policy on emergency response protocol. 19 violations. 19 separate charges, each one carefully constructed to sound worse than the last, each one designed to ensure that no court, no board, no reasonable person could possibly argue in her favor. Rachel's mission was collapsing. 3 months of intelligence gathering, of sitting silent while nurses mocked her, of watching the pharmacy supply logs, of photographing the discrepancies in the fentanyl counts, all of it was about to become irrelevant. Her nursing cover couldn't survive this scrutiny. Once administration started digging, they'd find inconsistencies, gaps, things that didn't quite add up to the resume of a woman with barely 3 months' experience. They'd dig deeper. They'd find the other identities. They'd uncover the investigation she was running beneath their hospital like a wire hidden under floorboards. She'd lose the case. She'd lose the ring. She'd lose the 1,000 small details that connected this hospital to a black market fentanyl network that was poisoning the city. "You're suspended pending investigation, effective immediately," the CNO said, her words final and cold and completely certain. "Badge and access card, please." Rachel removed her ID from around her neck and placed it on the desk. Her hands didn't shake. 3 nights later, at 2:47 in the morning, the monitors began to sing a different song. Rachel heard it from the hallway, that specific tone that meant the ranger's heart was doing something it shouldn't. She'd been restricted to observation only, Dr. Mercer's orders explicit and documented, her medical license under review, her presence in the ICU a courtesy that could be revoked with a single complaint. The ventilator hissed its mechanical rhythm as she stood outside the glass partition, watching the numbers on the screen. Blood pressure dropping. Oxygen saturation falling. The resident on night shift, a third year who'd never seen a chest fill with blood, froze like prey watching a predator. Rachel moved. She didn't hesitate. She didn't check for permission. Her feet carried her through the door and her hands reached for the trauma cart, muscle memory from Helm and Province overriding every rule the hospital had written. The crash cart scalpel was dull from months of disinfection, but a dull blade in steady hands moves faster than a sharp blade in trembling ones. She didn't have time to explain. She didn't have time to wait for orders. The ranger's chest was the only thing that mattered. Crack the sternum, access the cardiac chambers, massage the heart back to function while the resident watched in horror and the monitors climbed from single digits. She made the incision with one clean motion, felt the resistance of ribs beneath her fingers like a familiar language she'd learned in a place that didn't exist anymore. The scent of blood and antiseptic filled the space between her and consequence. 30 seconds. That's all it took to change everything. She opened his chest like someone reading a book she'd memorized. The heart lay there, beautiful and still, and her hand moved into the cavity without thinking, her fingers closing around the ventricle, squeezing in rhythm with the metronome of her own heartbeat. 70. 80. 88. The oxygen numbers climbed. His color changed from gray to pink. The resident finally moved, pushing epinephrine into the 4-line, and Rachel felt the drug surge through the ranger's system, felt his heart respond, felt the moment when biology decided he wasn't finished yet. The monitor showed sinus rhythm. Then it held. Held steady like a captain's hand on a ship's wheel during a storm. Dr. Mercer stood in the doorway, his face the color of old snow, his coffee cup frozen halfway to his mouth. He'd arrived to check on his patient, his recovering patient, his victory. Instead, he watched a temp nurse with a scalpel crack open a human chest and put it back together like she'd done it 1,000 times before. The next 8 hours belonged to damage control. Mercer didn't sleep. He didn't sit. He moved through Cedar Creek Medical like a man building a fortress from paperwork, each document another brick, each regulation another wall. He pulled Joint Commission Standard LD.03.03.01 on credentialed independent practitioners. He cited Hospital Bylaw Section 4.2.1 regarding scope of practice limitations. He found a 23-year-old regulation about emergency interventions and weaponized the phrase reasonable expectation of proper training, turning it into a cudgel. 19 violations. He listed each one on its own form, each one cross-referenced to the others, creating a web of institutional violations so intricate that untangling it would require months of legal review. Practicing medicine without a license. Performing invasive procedure without proper credentialing. Contaminating sterile field during emergency intervention. Operating without supervision. Using equipment outside scope of practice. He didn't mention that she'd saved a life. That wasn't the point. The point was hierarchy, credentials, the sacred distinction between those who'd earned their place through the proper channels and those who'd simply appeared one day and proven themselves competent. Competence without credentials was a threat worse than any patient death. Patient deaths were unavoidable. Competence without credentials was contagion. He added a memo recommending criminal prosecution for practicing medicine without licensure. He recommended her file be reported to the state nursing board with a recommendation for permanent license revocation. He copied the hospital attorney, the chief of medicine, the state medical board, and the licensing commission. By 6 in the morning, his office looked like a crime scene investigation had been conducted there. Papers covered every surface. His fingers were stained with highlighter ink. His tie hung loose. His eyes held the glitter of a man who'd finally found his weapon. Rachel sat in the Victory Diner on Victory Drive at 3 o'clock in the morning, the kind of diner that existed in every American city at that hour, fluorescent lights buzzing like dying insects, coffee that tasted like it had been brewed in the 1970s and never changed, a waitress who'd stopped asking questions years ago. The chipped ceramic mug held coffee that had gone cold an hour ago. She hadn't touched it. Her phone buzzed. The message from her handler was brief: extraction available. Mission abort. She could leave. She could walk out of this diner, drive to a coordinate 60 miles north, board a civilian aircraft registered to a dummy corporation, and disappear into a new identity before breakfast. The fentanyl investigation would collapse. The intelligence gathered would die. Her months of careful work would become a footnote in a file that nobody would read. But David's commanding officer was upstairs in a recovery bed, alive because she'd broken every rule that mattered to people who'd never held a human heart in their hands. She watched her reflection in the dark window, hollow-eyed, exhausted, the face of someone who'd made a choice and couldn't unmake it. The waitress refilled her untouched coffee without speaking. Rachel had seen this type before, the kind of woman who understood that some decisions couldn't be explained to people who'd never faced them. She texted back, "Stay in position." At Cedar Creek, the Rangers' monitors showed the steady evidence of a man who decided to keep living. Dr. Mercer stood outside his room at 5 in the morning, looking at his patient with an expression that mixed satisfaction with something darker. He'd won. The temp nurse had overstepped. The hierarchy had been violated. And now the system would correct itself, would file charges, would ensure that the sacred distinction between credentialed professionals and people who merely appeared competent would be reinforced for everyone to see. He whispered to the unconscious ranger, "Your temp nurse won't be bothering you anymore." Then he walked back to his office to add one final document, a recommendation that hospital security review security footage from the ICU for evidence of unauthorized medical practice. He knew what the footage would show. It would show someone performing an invasive procedure with impossible skill. It would show medical heroism. But that wasn't how he would frame it. He would frame it as a violation, a trespass, a breach of sacred hospital protocols. The law was clear. The rules were unambiguous. And Dr. Mercer had spent 32 years of his life ensuring that rules protected people like him from people like her. Rachel's handler called at 4 in the morning. They didn't use names. "The hospital is moving against you," he said. His voice carried the flat effect of someone delivering information that couldn't be softened. 19 formal violations. Criminal referral to state. You're suspended pending investigation. She closed her eyes. She'd known this was coming. The moment she picked up that scalpel, the moment she opened his chest, the moment she proved what she could do, it had all been inevitable. "The mission?" she asked. "Scattered," he said. "The network knows someone inside has blown their cover. They're moving supply routes. We're losing weeks of intelligence." The silence between them lasted exactly 3 seconds. Then he said, "Your call, Captain. Extraction or stay?" Rachel watched her reflection in the dark window. Hollow-eyed. Exhausted. Alive in a way that didn't have anything to do with being well. She thought about the ranger upstairs, about David asking his commanding officer if anyone had called, about a man who'd served in Helmand Province and would wake up in a hospital bed wondering who'd put his chest back together. She thought about the 17 other patients waiting for the supply chain to restart, the ones who needed those diverted drugs for legitimate pain. She thought about hierarchy and credentials and the vast distance between people who followed rules and people who understood what rules were for. "I'm staying," she said. The line went dead. At 6 in the morning, the sun rose over Savannah like a reminder that the world kept turning regardless of who won and who lost. The diner's neon sign flickered off. Rachel paid cash for coffee she hadn't drunk and walked out into the humid Georgia air that smelled like coming rain. Her phone buzzed. The hospital's suspension notice, official and documented and final. She'd been fired from a job that was never supposed to be her real job. She'd lost a cover identity that had taken months to establish. She'd blown an investigation that would take weeks to recover from. And somewhere in Cedar Creek Medical, a man was alive and breathing because she'd understood that some rules existed to be broken by people who knew exactly what they were breaking and why. By dawn, she was suspended. The hospital's official paperwork landed on the unit board at 5:16 a.m., a cold, typed accusation citing 19 separate violations. Practicing beyond scope of employment. Performing surgery without physician supervision. Contaminating a sterile field. Each line was a nail in the coffin of her cover. The temp agency that had placed her would get a call by noon. Background verification would begin. Questions would be asked about where Captain Rachel Torres had really come from, and the months of carefully gathered intelligence on the fentanyl diversion network, the dates, the names, the supply room access logs she'd photographed, would mean nothing if federal investigators dug into her credentials before she could deliver the final piece. For months of work. Gone in a single emergency thoracotomy. She sat in her car in the Cedar Creek parking lot at 6:15 a.m., watching the sun rise over Savannah, and understood the mathematics of her choice. A man named Marcus Wade was alive. A ranger who'd commanded her son's unit. But somewhere in the supply chain she'd been mapping, fentanyl destined for the streets was still moving. People she'd never meet would die because she'd had to choose between one life and many. That was the weight of command. That was the part that no amount of training ever prepared you for. The security escort met her at the employee entrance at 8:44 a.m. A young officer, barely 30, with the apologetic tone of someone following orders he didn't understand. "They said your badge is deactivated, Captain Torres." He glanced at his clipboard. "Ms. Torres, I need to accompany you to your locker." She didn't correct him. The temp identity came first. The hallways of Cedar Creek looked smaller in daylight. The fluorescent panels hummed their endless drone, and her footsteps echoed on the tile floor with military precision. 1, 2, 3, 4. The night shift had ended. The morning skeleton crew moved through their routines, and not one of them looked at her. Word had spread. Sabotage had a half-life measured in hours. Her locker was in the break room where the nursing staff had abandoned her 3 days ago. The security escort waited by the door as she turned the combination dial. Inside, a scrub top she'd never worn again, her personal phone, a photograph of David in dress uniform, and the small velvet box she kept closest to her heart. She reached for it. The intercom crackled overhead. EMS incoming, Trauma Bay. 5 minutes. Vehicle collision, multiple injuries. Activate trauma alert. The security escort didn't move. He was assigned to her, not to the hospital. Rachel closed the locker and straightened. The rhythm of emergency was ingrained so deep it lived in her bones, and for one moment, just one, her hands moved toward the door. Then she stopped. Not her responsibility anymore. The escort walked her toward the ICU exit, the long corridor stretching ahead, fluorescent lights turning the world pale and timeless. The ambulance bays were to the left. She could hear the sirens now, the yelp of arriving units, the controlled chaos of a trauma activation. Her absence would be noticed in the trauma bay. Dr. Mercer would probably smile. That was when the new patient came through. 2 paramedics wheeled a stretcher into the ICU intake area, the man on it dark-skinned, Middle Eastern features, his left arm strapped to his chest, multiple abrasions across his forehead and cheekbone. A car accident, from the look of it. Minor injuries relative to what she saw in trauma, but his vital signs were being relayed in rapid fire, BP 118/72, O2 sat 97% on room air, GCS score of 15, alert and oriented ×3. The security escort was guiding her past the ICU entrance when the man's eyes opened fully. His gaze swept across the hallway in the way of someone disoriented, then locked directly onto Rachel's face. His pupils dilated like he'd been struck. His breath caught. The monitor above his stretcher jumped, heart rate spiking from 84 to 112 in 2 seconds. His hand moved. His voice came out in Arabic, cracked and trembling with something between terror and awe, Al-Malak al-Aswad. The Black Angel. Rachel's blood stopped moving. The security escort glanced at her. "Do you know this patient?" She didn't answer. Couldn't. Her mind was in Helmand Province, in the Sanjin Valley, in the moments before fire and darkness and blood that wouldn't wash out. This man had a face she'd seen before. A uniform she'd seen before. An allegiance that had meant her death if he'd gotten the chance. An off-duty Marine, visiting a friend in the next room, had heard the Arabic call sign. His head snapped around. His body language shifted, from relaxed to alert in a single breath. He pulled out his phone, fingers moving fast across the screen, his eyes widening as he read something. Then he started speaking aloud. "Captain Rachel Torres. Silver Star, Helmand Province. For leading a combat rescue mission under fire that is completely irrelevant." Dr. Mercer's voice cut through the hallway like a scalpel. He was there suddenly, shoved forward through the gathering staff, his face flushed with anger and desperation. This woman performed unauthorized surgery without physician supervision, violated sterile protocols, and endangered a patient's life. She is? Distinguished Service Cross. The Marine's voice didn't waver. He was still reading. Actions during a 12-hour siege where she personally evacuated 43 wounded soldiers under continuous enemy fire. Mercer's jaw clenched. His hands balled into fists. The Marine continued. Captain in the United States Army Medical Corps. Trauma surgeon. Currently on special assignment, he looked up from his phone. His expression shifted. Recognition. Honor. Fear. More staff crowded the hallway now. A nurse whispered something to a resident. A respiratory tech stopped dead in his tracks. The foreign patient's eyes never left Rachel's face, and his expression was pure animal terror, the look of someone who'd suddenly understood they were in the presence of a woman they'd spent years hoping never to encounter again. Mercer's voice climbed higher. This still does not excuse her actions. She violated every protocol. She practiced beyond her scope. She contaminated the surgical field. And I have documented every. He stopped. His mouth opened and closed like he was suffocating on his own words. 47 times, Rachel said quietly. Her voice had changed. The timid temp nurse was gone. Command had leaked back in, that flat precision that came from having ordered people to hold positions under fire. I performed a field thoracotomy 47 times. In Kandahar. Bagran. Helmand Province. Intense while mortars fell outside. That procedure saved his life 3 nights ago, doctor. And you filed 19 violations for it. She didn't look away from Mercer as she spoke. The security escort had stopped walking. The Marine was staring at her like she was something from a story. The foreign patient was trying to press himself back against his stretcher, away from her, his chest heaving. The next thing that happened ended careers. Boot heels on tile. Sharp. Military rhythm. A 2-star general in dress uniform rounded the corner, accompanied by 3 officers whose ribbons created a constellation of service, blues and reds and golds catching the fluorescent light. The general was tall, with the posture of someone who'd spent 40 years making decisions that changed other people's lives. His eyes moved across the hallway once, taking in the scene, and then settled on Rachel. He came forward and delivered a salute, crisp, deliberate, the kind of salute you gave to a soldier who'd been away from the rank. Rachel returned it. Captain Torres. The general's voice carried across the hallway like it had trained through decades of command. Major General Hale, Defense Intelligence Agency. Your work here identified the entire supply theft network. Well done. Mercer's face went white. The color drained from his skin like someone had opened a valve. A full colonel stepped forward, reading from a tablet. Silver Star for Valor in Combat. Distinguished Service Cross with Oak Leaf Cluster. Purple Heart with Oak Leaf Cluster. Combat Action Badge. Expert Field Medical Badge. With each decoration, the hallway seemed to shrink. The walls pressed closer. Mercer backed away, his back hitting the ICU wall. I served with Captain Torres in Kandahar, a Navy captain said, stepping into the space. His voice was steady, the voice of someone speaking testimony. 16-hour surgery. Sandstorm outside. Morphine running low. Insurgents 200 meters from the field tent. She saved 47 soldiers that day. I know because I counted them as they left. The general's eyes moved to Mercer. Doctor, I understand you filed 19 violation reports against a decorated combat surgeon for performing a procedure she's personally executed 47 times in active combat zones. Mercer opened his mouth. Nothing came out. Rachel picked up her personal items from where she'd left them on the edge of an empty gurney. Her phone. The photograph of David. The small velvet box containing a medal that predated any of the ones they'd just listed, a piece of metal awarded in a ceremony no one spoke about, for actions in a place that didn't officially exist. She placed them in her jacket pocket with the same methodical care she'd used to apply tourniquets in the dark. The foreign patient on the stretcher was still watching her. His eyes followed her movements with the intensity of prey tracking a predator. "Wheel him to ICU 7, Rachel said to the paramedics. Not a request. Not a suggestion. Command. It moved from her mouth like muscle memory, like 20 years of authority had never left her bones. Monitor his vitals every 15 minutes. If his O2 dips below 95, get him on nasal cannula. He'll be fine. Neither paramedic questioned the order. A captain giving medical direction had a weight to it that transcended paperwork. The general was still there. Still watching her with the expression of someone who'd spent for months wondering if his asset was still alive. The investigation proceeds, he said quietly. You've given us everything we need. The network goes down this week. You did your job, Captain. Rachel nodded once and turned toward the exit. Behind her, Mercer found his voice again. It sounded small. Thin. Like something that had been hollowed out. Captain? But the violations, I thought she was just. Nobody answered him. The security escort followed her to the glass doors. He didn't ask questions. He didn't apologize. He was just a kid following orders, and she'd already forgiven him the moment he walked into the break room. Outside, the Savannah heat hit like a wave. The parking lot was empty except for scattered cars. She could still hear the sirens from the trauma bays. That code was probably 3 minutes from arrival. The surgical team would be scrubbing in. Dr. Mercer would either be in that operating room, or he wouldn't be, and either way, his reputation had just died in a hallway while witnesses watched. She didn't feel triumph. That was the thing they never told you about endings. They didn't feel like endings. They felt like the moment before the next mission, and all the weight you'd been carrying didn't get lighter, it just shifted onto your shoulders in a new shape. Rachel Torres drove out of Cedar Creek Medical's parking lot at 9:17 a.m. In the rearview mirror, the hospital grew smaller. Her son would be calling soon. The general would have messages waiting. And somewhere in this city, a fentanyl pipeline was about to collapse because she'd spent for months being humiliated by a man who never understood that the most dangerous people were the ones with nothing left to prove. The foreign national patient lay in the ICU recovery room, his eyes tracking the ceiling. When Rachel entered to check his vitals, his gaze locked onto her face with the kind of recognition that stops time. His body went rigid. His lips moved, forming words in Arabic that hung in the recirculated hospital air like a prayer or a curse. Al-Malik al-Aswad, he whispered. The Black Angel. His voice cracked. His hand trembled, reaching toward her. Rachel's expression didn't change. She adjusted his for line with the same mechanical precision she'd used for 4 months, but an off-duty Marine waiting in the hallway, visiting his wife in the adjacent room, had heard those words. He knew that call sign. Every combat veteran in Helmand Province knew that call sign. The Marine's name was Petty Officer James Halloway. He'd been security attaché for Joint Task Force 2010, which meant he'd watched classified briefings about the operations that name represented. His hands moved before his brain caught up. He pulled out his phone. He found Cedar Creek's employee database. He found Rachel's temporary nursing file. And then he found her actual file, the one buried 3 layers deep in the Army's personnel system. His screen showed a photograph from 8 years ago, Captain Rachel Torres, dress uniform, silver star hanging against her chest. No. No way. He spoke the words aloud. His phone was already in his hands. His fingers moved across the screen, pulling up every unclassified detail. The text began to appear, and with each word, his understanding of this entire hospital's last week rewrote itself in real time. Combat rescue under fire. Helmand Province, Sanjin Valley. 19 minutes under sustained small arms fire, 2 soldiers extracted from a burning Humvee, 0 casualties. Silver Star. The second highest award for valor in the United States military, worn by fewer than 3,000 living officers. The Marine walked to the ICU door. He took a breath. Then he stepped inside and asked to speak with whoever was currently supervising the trauma ward. The charge nurse pointed to the conference room where Dr. Mercer was reviewing patient charts, his expression carrying the satisfied look of a man who'd successfully destroyed a competitor. Halloway didn't knock. He pushed the door open and his voice cut through the fluorescent-lit silence like a blade. Dr. Mercer? I need you to listen to what I'm about to read. The petty officer's phone was already extended, the screen bright between them. His voice was steady, military precise, each word landing with the weight of an official record. Captain Rachel Torres. Commissioned Army Officer. 8 years active duty. Combat Medic rating with Advanced Surgical Qualification. Silver Star. Helmand Province. For leading a combat rescue under fire that saved the lives of 2 soldiers and prevented the loss of a critical intelligence asset. Halloway paused. He looked directly at Mercer. She's a decorated officer, Doctor. And according to this file, her last assignment was classified. Mercer's face shifted. The color drained like someone pulling a plug on a bathtub. His mouth opened. Nothing came out. Word traveled through Cedar Creek like spilled coffee spreading across a tile floor. By the time Rachel finished checking the foreign national patient's cardiac rhythm, 17 people knew. By the time she stepped into the hallway, 32 people knew. The nursing staff that had abandoned her at lunch now stood in clusters, their expressions shifting between shame and vindication. Mercer emerged from his conference room, his face a study in confusion and dawning horror, and Rachel's flat gaze met his for exactly 3 seconds. That was all the time he needed to understand that his entire campaign against her had been built on sand. That the woman he'd called incompetent, undertrained, a liability, she was the kind of person who made decisions in seconds that determined whether soldiers lived or died. The hospital's chief of staff appeared within an hour. Dr. Patricia Ashford, a woman with silver-streaked hair and the kind of authority that didn't require raising her voice. She walked directly to Rachel. "Captain Torres, I'd like to apologize on behalf of Cedar Creek Medical." Rachel's composure didn't fracture. "Apology accepted, Dr. Ashford." "The investigation." Ashford's expression hardened. "Already moving forward. Your temporary file is being corrected as we speak. And Dr. Mercer is in the administrator's office with legal counsel." Rachel nodded once. "Thank you." She turned back to her patient documentation as if the conversation had never happened. But the real shock came at 2:33 p.m. when the hospital lobby doors opened and a 2-star Army general walked through, his dress uniform so crisp it looked like it could cut paper, his insignia catching the afternoon light. Major General Thomas Hale. His presence alone made every conversation in the lobby stop. He walked directly to the ICU, asked for Rachel by rank, and when she appeared, he executed a sharp salute with the kind of precision only 2 decades of military service could create. "Captain Torres." His voice carried the tone of a commanding officer greeting someone who'd just completed a critical mission. Rachel returned the salute. Her voice dropped an octave, the deferential nurse completely gone, replaced by something that sounded like steel wrapped in velvet. "General Hale." Hale's expression shifted into something that looked like pride. "Captain, your work here identified the supply theft network across 4 hospitals in the southeast. 17 diversion points. 93 arrests scheduled for simultaneous execution across 3 states, happening in the next 4 hours. Well done." Rachel's jaw tightened. Not from emotion. From the realization that the 4 months of being called incompetent, of watching the nursing staff treat her like a liability, of the suspension and the humiliation had actually been the cover story working exactly as intended. Every moment Mercer had tried to destroy her credibility had actually made her invisible. Perfect invisibility. "The Ranger?" she asked. "Stable," the general replied. "Asking for someone named David Torres." Rachel's expression softened by approximately 2 millimeters, a change that would have been invisible to anyone not trained to detect micro-expressions during interrogation. "My son." "His commanding officer." "Sir, I'll need to contact him immediately." The general smiled. "Already done. He's on his way here now. Landed at Hunter Army Airfield 40 minutes ago." Through the ICU windows, Rachel could see federal agents moving through the hospital corridors, their credentials visible, their purpose unmistakable. She watched them. One of them approached Mercer as he emerged from the administrator's office. His face went pale. Then they were talking, and Mercer's hands began to shake. The conference room became a courtroom within the hour. 2 federal agents, both with the kind of calm that came from having testified in cases that mattered. Mercer sat across from them, his hospital ID hanging from his neck like a noose. "Dr. Mercer," the first agent began, opening a laptop with the kind of deliberate slowness that made everything feel official. "We've been reviewing your pharmacy access logs for the past 6 months. Mercer's voice came out thin. "I'm an attending physician. I have legitimate access." The agent turned the laptop around. Security footage timestamps played across the screen in fast motion, showing Mercer entering the pharmacy supply room at 2:53 a.m. on a Thursday, 3:15 a.m. on a Saturday, 4:33 a.m. on a Tuesday. Times when no trauma existed. No emergencies. No legitimate medical reason. These show you accessing the pharmacy when you had no scheduled patients requiring controlled substances. The second agent opened a file. Hospital IT identified that someone attempted to delete these security footage files yesterday at 11:38 p.m. from your office terminal. Mercer's hands trembled. His voice cracked. That's impossible. I never. The first agent slid a single sheet across the table. Dr. Mercer, your employment is terminated, effective immediately. Your medical license is under review by the State Medical Board pending this investigation. Mercer's face went the color of old newspaper. The escort happened at 4:15 p.m. 2 federal agents on either side of Mercer, his hospital ID already removed, his office already sealed with yellow evidence tape. The nursing staff watched from doorways and hallway shadows as he passed. His face was blank, not the composed blank of someone trained in battlefield medicine, but the hollow blank of someone whose entire constructed identity had collapsed in 72 minutes. By evening, the news cycle had picked it up. Local news ran the story: prominent physician under investigation for medical supply diversion, suspected links to black market opioid distribution network. The hospital released a statement emphasizing their cooperation with federal authorities. The nursing staff shared the news articles in group chats, most comments expressing a version of "I always knew something was off about him." Rachel stood at the ICU observation window, watching a team of federal agents load boxes from Mercer's office into an evidence van. Her expression remained neutral. General Hale stood beside her, his presence commanding the space. "Your son is in the family waiting room," the general said. "Lieutenant Wade is stable. He's been asking for you." Rachel turned from the window. "Sir, am I cleared to return to active duty?" Hale's expression shifted into something between satisfaction and respect. "Captain, you never left active duty. You just borrowed some scrubs for 4 months. Pack what you need. You're returning to Fort Sam Houston next week. Teaching position. Combat Medical Officer Training Program." Rachel's composure didn't break, but her eye showed something like relief. "Yes, sir." She walked toward the waiting room, moving through hallways she'd walked for 114 days, and nobody tried to stop her or question her or ask for an apology. The identity was out now. The mask was off. And what remained was exactly what had been there all along: a decorated Army officer who'd performed field medicine under impossible pressure and never once asked for recognition. The door to the waiting room opened and David Torres stood up. Army Sergeant, 24 years old, his face a younger version of his mother's. The embrace lasted exactly 5 seconds. Tactical. Professional. But his eyes betrayed what his composure wouldn't. "Mom." He stepped back. "Lieutenant Wade is asking for you." Rachel nodded. "Let's go see him." They walked together toward the ICU, and behind them, nobody watched because they'd stopped noticing Rachel hours ago. What they were seeing now was what they should have seen all along: a soldier coming home from deep cover. A warrior returning from her mission. The final image came 6 months later. Rachel stood in her Army dress uniform at a memorial service held at Cedar Creek Medical. 17 names were read aloud, soldiers whose lives had been changed by the fentanyl that had flowed through Dr. Mercer's supply diversion network. The awareness campaign she'd helped design would be mandatory training for every hospital in the Southeast. The supply chain protocols she'd identified vulnerabilities in were being rewritten nationwide. And somewhere in a warehouse in Charleston, Dr. Mercer loaded medical supply boxes into trucks under the supervision of his court-mandated employment, his medical license permanently revoked, his pension forfeited, 10 years probation stretching before him like a very long sentence. Sometimes the bravest warriors carry stethoscopes, not guns. We appreciate every one of you watching. Please hit like if you're enjoying this, subscribe if you want more stories like it, and leave a comment telling us where you're tuning in from.